In the last video, I finished the inside of the garden room, and now it's time to move back outside and tackle the decking, which, if you've come this far in building a garden room, is a really easy and fun project. Now, decking is an interesting project unto itself, but in relation to a garden room, having a deck may or may not be necessary depending on your site and how you've built the floor and foundations. The two reasons for having a deck are to hide the gap under a timber floor, though this can be achieved by continuing the cladding down to ground level or thereabouts. The other reason, and the main one for me, is that my door threshold is too much of a step up from ground level, so the deck provides a platform so that the inside and outside are a similar height, and the step up is set further back. You could just build a step in front of the doors, but with my garden room being on the tall side, I reckon a deck across the whole front helps it look a bit more proportional. First, we need to rewind back to part 2 and take a look at what rules apply to decking under permitted development, as I didn't specify a deck in my planning application. It's pretty simple. The top just needs to be no more than 300mm from ground level, and I'm assuming the same rule applies as we discussed in this video, that you can take that measurement from the highest ground around the deck so that it can exceed 300mm elsewhere if necessary. So the timber joist that will be holding up the decking will attach to the garden room on one side, but need to be supported on the other. For this I could have used blocks in the same way I did for the floor of my garden room, but instead I opted for fence posts in order to minimise the surface area that could collect standing water because the deck is exposed to the elements, whereas under the building the blocks will remain dry. I used a post hole digger to dig a vertical hole around 3 times the width of the 4x4 treated posts, so about a foot wide. The posts won't extend that far from the ground, so I don't need to go down too far, but the clay, whilst heavy, is easy to dig, so I managed to get down to around 70cm. However, because it's clay, I wanted a decent amount of drainage under the post, which I'd saved the last bit of hardcore for, but stones or gravel work just as well and also act to help level the post. Next, I attached the first joist to the garden room. More on this in a minute. I levelled the joist and then clamped it to the post. As the posts are so short, they don't need to be perfectly plumb, just close enough is fine. I attached the two together with 100mm screws and then half filled the hole with water and poured postcrete in. Postcrete always feels a bit haphazard when you're doing it, but it always comes out nice and strong. I've covered this process in much more detail in this video if you want to check it out. One thing I do want to point out here is that if I were doing my foundations again with blocks, instead of just filling the hole around them with hardcore and compressing it, I'd use postcrete like this or possibly concrete. That would have been a lot stronger. So next I could go off the first joist and then mark up each subsequent joist location on the Tyvek membrane. How wide apart your joists are will depend on what decking you're using. Mine are 32mm timber, so I could probably have spaced them around 600mm apart, but I stuck to 400. Because we're not lining up our joists with sheet material, you don't have to be too exact, and you could choose a more random joist spacing like 500mm for example. Once I had my spacing, I could add the second post in the same way as the first, and now I just need to connect the two posts to each other. For this I'm using a 2x9" timber, not so much for the strength as the span is only 2 or 3 meters, but because I had some left over from doing the roof, and also because I need it to come close to ground level so I have something to attach decking to so that I'm minimising any gap at the bottom. To attach the 2x9 I used 3 coach screws in each post. These are pretty heavy duty and strong enough to support the 2x9 and all the joists. For the screws to end up flush with the board, I first used a spade bit to drill a wide circle to accommodate the head and built-in washer of the coach screws. After that, I could cut the tops off the posts so everything was level. I then repeated these steps for the third and the fourth posts. Once the postcrete was fully cured, I applied cement to the top in a pyramid shape to shed water away from the posts, which helps prevent rot. The next step was to fill in the rest of the joists. I decided on a length of joist of 1.2 meters. I felt this was enough to be able to open the doors without having to step off the deck, and wide enough to put seating on the deck. 1.2 meters is also double the length of my roof overhang, which I thought might make for some nice symmetry, and it also meant I could just cut a 2.4 meter length in half and have no wastage. Using the domestic floor plans as a proxy, 2x4 timbers are more than strong enough for a 1.2 meter span, so that's what I used, and no noggins were needed either. I set the height of the joist so that with the decking boards, the top of the deck would come up just under the door sill. So each joist, where cut, I treated with wood preserver and attached to the 2x9s with joist hangers. These are from the same place I got them for the floor, Builder's Metalwork. I find that in places like Selco, they tend to be 50mm wide and so don't fit as well as these. Mine did come with a bottom flap, which was in the way, so I just knocked these back with a hammer. I used square twist nails to attach them and then 2 100mm screws through the 2x9. On the garden room side I did the same, but as I can't screw through from the other side, I added in a few longer screws and nails along with the square twist nails to make sure they're secure, especially as I'm nailing through into the OSB rather than direct to the floor timbers. Let's say your garden room is built with brick or block, or you're building a deck attached to your house. In that case, you'd first need to use masonry bolts to attach a ledger board, a 2x6 for example, and then you can attach your joist to the ledger board with joist hangers in the same way I'm doing here. Next, we rolled out the weed fabric. It's probably even more important to use it here than under my garden room, as the spacing between the decking boards will allow some light through and therefore weed growth. I still had a bunch of rubble left that I couldn't fit into the skips, so this felt like a very good place to hide it and to hold the weed fabric in place. Because the deck is reasonably high, I needed a step between the deck and the ground. So the deck in front of the doors, once the decking boards are on, will be around 30 centimeters high. Half of that is 15 centimeters or 6 inches, which is the riser length. There's an easy rule of thumb to work out how long the tread should be for exterior steps, which is 2 times the height of the risers plus the tread should equal roughly 26 inches to feel comfortable walking up. So that means my tread needs to be 14 inches long. There was no need for a stringer board for just one step, so I simply attached treated timber resting on the floor to the 2x9 with 2 screws, and then everything was held together with the decking boards. I think it might have looked cool if I'd done an inverted step instead, but that was a bit more complicated to create. Last job before the decking boards was to add some timber to the structure where the land falls away so that I have something to attach the decking to hide the gap. So, decking boards. There are 3 main categories to choose from. Treated softwood, much like what the rest of the deck is made from. These require a bit more maintenance. They're not going to last for decades, but they are a lot cheaper than the other 2 options. Second is a hardwood. There are lots of different species you can choose from. Balau is a really nice wood, for example. These are more visually appealing than softwood, they last longer and they require less maintenance, but they are more expensive. The problem with all wood decking is that over time it will lose its colour and silver due to the sunlight, and there's no UV resistant oil that I know of that will give a long lasting protection on horizontal surfaces like decking, where water will sit on the surface and degrade the oil. The third option is composite, which is a composite of wood and plastic. It doesn't degrade or lose its colour, there's no maintenance other than a good clean now and again, and you can get it in pretty much any colour, and there are also ones that mimic the grain and colours of wood. So when I was choosing, it seemed to me that hardwood, as lovely as it looks when first laid down, is neither cost effective nor is it maintenance free. Composite would definitely be my first choice, but I was looking to save money at this stage, so I went for softwood with the idea that in 10 years or so, if it's worn out, I can easily replace it with composite. Now the next bit I found quite curious because prior to this project, when I thought of decking, what came to mind is this grooved, undulating profile, but I wanted a smooth deck, and when buying the boards it does state that they're reversible, so you can have the smooth side facing upwards. But I figured there must be a good reason why the groove style is so prevalent, but when I looked into it I couldn't find anything to support it. In fact, the opposite. The channels, unless there's a decent slope on the deck, will just fill up with water, dirt and moss. Nor do the grooves help with grip. In fact, they lessen the surface area contact between your shoe and the deck, and it's also less comfortable when you're barefoot. And finally, if you have the groove side downwards, this allows air between the decking and the joists so moisture doesn't accumulate and cause rot. So I don't know how this trend took off, it only seems to be done this way in the UK. It's not wrong of course, if you like the look great, or perhaps I'm missing something here, but I really like the look of a smooth deck. Okay, so attaching the boards. Wherever I cut one, I dipped it in wood preserver and laid the board out. There needs to be a gap between each plank to let water drain away, and I decided on a 3mm gap and used my leftover window packers placed on the joist to get that even spacing. To attach, I'm using decking screws naturally, and initially I thought I'd try countersinking to look a bit neater, but I abandoned that pretty quickly. The screws are self-countersinking after all. Maybe if you're using a more expensive decking, it could be worthwhile. Similarly, you could use a string line to get all your screws in a perfectly straight line. I just did it by eye instead, not wanting to let perfectionism get in the way of good enough. I've got to fill in this section here, and I have put in the piece that's going to go there, and then I'm scribing. in order to create the piece and to know how far to cut, and it varies throughout the length of the bit, and that's not because of the wall not being straight, it's because the timber's not straight and it's bowed over however many courses. So in order to work out how to cut it, instead of measuring each one, we can scribe by using a scrap piece. So making sure that this plank here is tight with the spacers, and then this goes here, and you push it far against the wall, and then you can draw a pencil line along. And I've done this so you can see my pencil line. Now that doesn't take into account the fact that I'm going to need spacers between what will be the board that goes here and then here. So I'm going to have to come a few mils in from the line. But of course it doesn't matter if I have a bit of a gap here either, because that will be covered by cladding. One last thing to point out is that I covered the end grain of the top of the deck with the decking boards on the side, and then I covered the end grain of the sides with the decking on the front. So you can only see the end grain of those front boards when viewing the deck from the side. Neater still would have been to cut a 45-degree mitre so all the end grain is hidden, so you may want to consider doing that. Final job was to protect the deck. There are a myriad of products on the market, including oils, stains and paints. I hadn't 100% decided on what cladding I'd be using on the front of the garden room, and therefore I didn't know what colour to try to match or contrast against, so I kicked the can down the road by going for a clear decking oil. It's a lot easier to go darker later on than it is to go lighter. I applied 2 coats with a brush, and this needs to be done every year or so to nourish the wood and replace the natural oils that are lost over time. It looked really good, and I'd even started a bit of landscaping, but the builders who did the extension next door over winter used the deck to store their materials, and after a year it's lost its luster and the silvering I talked about earlier has started to take hold. To clean it, you can use one or a combination of a pressure washer, sanding, or a wood reviver or a restorer gel, and then reapply the oil. Another reason I've been reluctant to use a stain or decking paint are the horror stories of it peeling and flaking. This paint, for example, is guaranteed for 5 years on horizontal timber surfaces, but what's not clear is what happens after that. Can it just be painted over, or does it need to be stripped back first? So if anyone has used a product that stood the test of time, I'd be very keen to know. It's all a bit of a faff in my opinion, so as I said earlier, if you can afford composite, that seems to me to be by far the best choice. When we get to timber cladding, we don't have these issues because 1, you're not walking on it, and 2, it's vertical, so there's no standing water degrading the finish. So the next video is on soffits and battens. Now on the face of it, I realise that may not seem like the most exciting of topics, but there's a lot of loose ends to tie up, and it's the start of discussing cladding, so not one to be missed. I'll see you then.